They did it. Successfully. And that's smart. They handled this on every level. This movie's smart. I don't care. I dig it. I love this movie.
Yeah, the only strong criticism that I have read about this movie that is not linked to something which I will categorize as emotional criticism, right? Like, Freddy's, like, to avoid all that, right? Is that people didn't like that Freddy was able to jump from the dream world to reality when they were trying to bury him in hallowed ground. I have no problem with it. I don't. And it has nothing to do with part 2, because in part 2 he was coming to the real world. I'll ignore part 2 just like Wes Craven was. Not that I don't like the movie. He had just revealed, not minutes prior, that he had, the power from these souls. And whatever power he had at the beginning of this movie from his Noes and pre-death timeline, here he now had a few fresh souls. And maybe that was him cashing in his chip.
Oh, got stronger.
When he did that. Because some people also say, well, why didn't he kill the psychiatrist? But again, like we were talking about this in a recent podcast, I think, where I was bringing up, like, people see someone do something in a movie and they assume they can just do it at will all the time. But maybe it's strenuous. Maybe Gandalf's magic needs to be used sparingly for a reason. Maybe that's why he uses a sword against the Balrog after he tries to stab it off, right? Maybe that's so maybe Freddy had X amount of power that he could pull that off.
I mean, Luke could only force project for so long.
Right. And the Emperor turned old. He wasted away when he was trying to save his own life at one point in Revenge of the Sith. So, like, again, people have these powers, but it doesn't mean they can do it all the time or use it however they want. Maybe it's almost like he used that fuel from those souls to do what he did. And he literally, even though they show him going, like at the end, like some WrestleMania video game. But maybe that was really just the end of the time he was allotted with that power, and he was then, it's like against his will, he was pulled back to the dream world, and he literally just didn't have time to kill Dr. Neil.
And it makes narrative sense. I mean, every second that skeleton is on screen is more money, and maybe he just went into the skeleton because it's his skeleton. I mean, maybe there's maybe it was trapped in a trunk, and it didn't make sense to do it, but now he's able to cash some soul chips in, get in his skeleton to save his life.
Right.
I mean, maybe that's the only thing he can do it in. I guess the problem is people interpret each character differently. So when they do something that they don't want or understand, they hate it. But that's what the character did in the movie, so I rolled with it. I dug it.
Well, again, it's like if something happens in the movie, some people decide to do that for a reason. Try to err on the side of rationalizing why they did it instead of why you're pissed that they didn't.
I hate it. Well, any final thoughts about this flick before we get out of here?
Gosh, again, I said that this was the Lord of the Rings of the Noes franchise. This is like another Jennifer's Body kind of revelatory pod for us. We can dig our heels as deep as we want to into the Event Horizon and Bram Stoker's Dracula, some of our highlight episodes, right? They weren't changing the way we looked at the movies. They just made us look closer.
Yeah.
And Jennifer's Body and this one, I feel like, are the kinds of movies that when we start to put our critical hats on, make us better at viewing movies fairly.
My times watching Jennifer's Body and Nightmare on Elm Street 3, and then watching them again a decade later, 17 years later, completely changes the way you see them. It felt good, man. It felt good. It felt good to explore these movies because I had a mindset towards them, and now it's changed. I dig it. I'm a big fan of Nose 3.
It makes me want to pick out our cinematic pickaxe and dig to find more of these gems that historically most people overlook for their value.
I think this is going to be a big episode because I think it's going to be like a total recall in that critics loved it, audiences loved it, it made a lot of money. And it's still beloved by audiences. Generally. How's that sound? Generally
sure,
beloved.
Fair.
So it's a weird movie that it's like a cult classic, but it was also a blockbuster. But then audiences and critics like it. It's an interesting mix. And I think it's going to do well for us. So I'm glad you suggested it.
And before we close, Mark, I mean, people might be wondering what happens to Kristen, Joey, and Kincaid.
Oh.
But they're going to be in the opening scenes of a movie that we'll be discussing in the near future, because we're doing the continuous storyline of Noe's 3, 4, and 5, which is the only continuous story arc in this franchise.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I love these series that we get on, because if we would have done all the doing the entire Nightmare on Elm Street in a row, I would rather do 3, 4, and 5, because there's a continuous storyline. I dig it. We're not bouncing all over the place. Yeah. Well, this was fun, man. Thank you for suggesting this.
Sure. My pleasure.
So for me, Mark Hoffmeyer, and for John, still fighting off Freddy Worm, living good.
He's still on my toe.
This is Movies, Films, and Flicks. We'll see you next week.